Charles W. Morgan is an American whaling ship whose active service period was during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Built in 1841, ships of this type were usually used to harvest the blubber of whales for whale oil, which was commonly used in lamps. The ship has served as a museum ship since the 1940s, and is now an exhibit at the Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic, Connecticut. She is the world's oldest surviving merchant vessel, and the only surviving wooden whaling ship from the 19th-century American merchant fleet. She was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1966. Construction: Charles Wall Morgan chose Jethro and Zachariah Hillman's shipyard to construct a new ship at their shipyard in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Charles W. Morgan's live oak keel was laid down in February 1841 and fastened together with copper bolts. The bow and stern pieces of live oak were secured to the keel by an apron piece. The sturdy stern post was strengthened with hemlock root and white oak. Yellow pine shipped from North Carolina was used for the ship's beams, and hemlock or hackmatack was used for the hanging knees. Construction of the Morgan proceeded until April 19, 1841, when the workers went on strike, demanding a 10-hour workday. The strike gathered support until it encompassed the shipyard, the oil refineries and the cooper shops. Charles Morgan was appointed chairman of the employers and tasked to resolve the strike. Morgan opposed their demands, and a meeting with four master mechanics ended in failure. On May 6, an agreement was reached when the workers accepted a 10.5-hour workday. Work resumed on the ship without incident, and it was launched on July 21, 1841. The ship was registered as a caravel of 106.12 feet in length, 27 feet 2.12 inches in breadth, and 13 feet 7.14 inches in depth. Her displacement was 314 gross tons. The ship's construction and rigging cost a total of $32,562.08 and was assessed a shipyard fee of $2.25 per day for its 258 construction. Labor charges was billed at $1.75 a day for 129.5 days. The ship was outfitted at Rogers Wharf for the next 2 months while preparations were made for its first voyage. The name Charles W. Morgan was initially rejected by its namesake builder before being used. Captain Thomas Norton sailed Charles W. Morgan into the Atlantic alongside Adeline Gibbs and Nassau towards the Azores. A stop was made at Port-au-Pym on Fowl Island to gather supplies before crossing the Atlantic and passing Cape Horn before charting a course to the north. On December 13, the men launched in their whaling boats and took their first whale, harpooning it and killing it with the thrust of a lance under the side fin. The Morgan entered the port of Callao in early February and departed again on the 10th for the Galapagos Islands. In 1844, the ship sailed to the Kodiak grounds before sailing for home on August 18. Charles W. Morgan returned to her home port in New Bedford on January 2 in 1845. The voyage of 3 years and 3 months resulted in 59 whales being processed for 1,600 barrels of sperm oil, 800 barrels of right whale oil and 5 tons of whale bone that netted a total of $53,052.56. Service life. In her 80 years of service from her home port of New Bedford, Massachusetts, she made 37 voyages ranging in length from 9 months to 5 years. Charles W. Morgan, in total, brought home 54,483 barrels of sperm and whale oil and 152,934 pounds of whale bone. She sailed in the Indian and South Atlantic Oceans, surviving ice and snowstorms. Her crew survived a cannibal attack in the South Pacific. Between 1888 and 1904 she was based in San Francisco. Charles W. Morgan had more than 1,000 whalemen of all races and nationalities in her lifetime. Her crew included not only Americans, but sailors from Cape Verde, New Zealand, the Seychelles, Guadeloupe, and Norfolk Island. The ship's crew averaged around 33 men per voyage. As with other whale ships in the 19th century, Charles W. Morgan was often home to the captain's family. Charles W. Morgan was owned and managed by the J. and W.R. Wing Company of New Bedford. During her years of service, Charles W. Morgan was used in several movies, including Miss Petticoats, Down to the Sea and Ships and Java Head. Preservation: Charles W. Morgan was nearly destroyed in 1924 when Sankaty, a steamer, caught fire and broke free of her mooring lines. The burning Sankaty drifted across the river and into Charles W. Morgan a port quarter, but the Fairhaven firemen managed to save Charles W. Morgan. This event spurred Harry Nayland and some New Bedford citizens to restore and preserve Charles W. Morgan. Unsuccessful in their efforts, Nayland persuaded Colonel Edward Howland Robinson Greene to save the ship. Nayland appealed to Greene that the Morgan was of historical importance and was a family heirloom because Charles W. Morgan was once co-owned by Greene's grandfather and his wife's company. Greene had the ship towed to his estate in Round Hill and founded Whaling in Shrine consisting of himself, Nayland and John Bullard, the great-grandson of Charles Warren Morgan. Charles W. Morgan underwent restoration by Captain George Fred Tilton and was turned into an exhibition for Greene's estate in a berth constructed by Frank Taylor. On the 86th anniversary of Charles W. Morgan a launch, Greene held a dedicatory ceremony and gave the ship to Whaling Enshrined on July 21, 1926. Charles W. Morgan a fate came into question when Tilton died in 1932 and Greene died in 1935, resulting in lengthy court proceedings over the Greene's estate. The 1938 New England hurricane damaged Charles W. Morgan a hull and tore the sails. Whaling Enshrined attempted, but could not secure funds for the ship. In 1941, Charles W. Morgan was saved by the Marine Historical Association based on Taylor's word that the ship could be freed and towed to Mystic, Connecticut. Taylor's crew dug Charles W. Morgan from her berth and dredged a channel for her to pass through, but the first attempt to pull the ship free was unsuccessful. More digging and caulking of the ship preceded the Morgan a successful tugging into the channel, and the century-old hull withstood the move and floated into bay provided by the Coast Guard cutter General Greene. Charles W. Morgan was towed to the old berth in Fairhaven for several days of preparations and repairs prior to the trip to Mystic. On November 5, 1941, General Greene pulled Charles W. Morgan from the wharf only to have her be caught by the tide and swept downstream, coming to rest on a mud flat and requiring 2 hours to be freed. The journey came to an end on November 8 when Charles W. Morgan passed through the Mystic Bridge and was moored in the Mystic Seaport. The Mystic Seaport took shape around Charles W. Morgan with the restoration of its buildings and historic ships that came to reside at the museum. Stackpole writes, "Over it all, the Morgan presided like old Neptune the centerpiece, the king seated on a throne of gravel, towering high above the scene." Restoration. Charles W. Morgan arrived at Mystic Seaport in December 1941. The ship was declared a National Historic Landmark and listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1966. In 1971, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring Charles W. Morgan. For the first 30 years of the ship's life at Mystic Seaport, she was surrounded by a bed of sand to prevent her from sinking. Even so, she was open to the public and was the centerpiece of an recreated 19th-century maritime village museum inspired by colonial Williamsburg. She was, and is, the only preserved 19th-century whaling ship. A restoration and preservation project was undertaken in 1968 which resulted in her being made seaworthy and the sand bed was removed. Prior to the 1968 restoration, she had a wide white stripe on her sides painted with large black squares that resembled gun ports when viewed at a distance. This camouflage was often employed by 19th-century merchant ships to make them resemble warships so as to deter pirates and hostile navies. In 2010, Mystic Seaport was engaged in a multi-million-dollar restoration, intended to restore the ship to seaworthy status. On July 21, 2013, marking the 172nd anniversary of the vessel unregistered trademark S initial launch, Charles W. Morgan was relaunched into the Mystic River. During the summer of 2014, Charles W. Morgan sailed her 38th voyage on tour of New England seaports which included New London, Newport, Boston and her hometown of New Bedford. In culture, Charles W. Morgan has been depicted in mixed media in different ways for nearly a century. In 1971, Melbourne Brindle of Bridgeport, Connecticut designed 4 commemorative stamps of historic landmarks including Charles W. Morgan. Notes: in the last sale down east, Charles W. Morgan's length was reported as being just over 105 feet long. The book conflicts with Stackpole by listing the ship's return from its first voyage on January 1, 1845 instead of the following day. The goods detailed within match, but the figure of $69,591 is listed instead of $53,052.56. See also: List of National Historic Landmarks in Connecticut, National Register of Historic Places listings in New London County, Connecticut, List of museum ships, other preserved 19th-century sailing ships, USS Constitution, USS Niagara, USS Constellation, Cutty Sark, FEM Morrissey/Ernestina, Coronet. References. External links: Deck prisms on the Charles W. Morgan.